the next presenter. Next presenter is Nejma. Miss Nejma, are you there already?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Yeah, hello. Welcome to this session. And then maybe you are better in introducing yourself. So introduce yourself quickly and then take the floor. Thank you.
Sure thing. Let me try to share my screen here. Let's see.
Yeah, I can see something. Yes.
Good. Excellent. Oops. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you very much. My name is Nejma Belarbi. I'm a consultant with Terra Ethics and an ethnobotanist, and I'm also in British Columbia, which I thought was very interesting. It was nice that I wasn't the only one waking up early today. I do, Terra Ethics does a lot of work in supporting collaborative design towards ethical sustainability and equity in practice. And not just in Canada, but we work internationally as well. I'm also a board director at the Grassroots Institute. And some of the work that I do is around the rights of nature, especially through an Indigenous lens, which was in another presentation I did this week, which talked a lot more about the rights of nature through an Indigenous lens. But of course, in being able to do that, we do a lot of work in bringing the foundations and the fundamentals of the rights of nature. And so therefore the conceptualization of the relationship of ecosystems and their stewardship, which I think is very much supported by the presentation we just saw by Dr. Jesse Montes here. Because it is very much based on the relationship of ecosystems and their stewardship. So of course, inevitably, much of my research touches on the sacredness and spirituality of this conceptualization. Again, I'm very honored to be here today with all of you and share some of our insights on this topic. And one of the things that we are very aware of is that there is a mosaic of worldviews relating people to environments. And it is literally as diverse as the biodiversity that exists on the planet, which is part of the concept of an article I wrote for Terra Lingua called The Obvious Mirror, which mirrors the biocultural diversity in the world within our own society and the way that we interact with each other. So I'm sure that many have are familiar with traditional ecological knowledge in this platform. And we've heard, quite a bit about it. But I just wanted to sort of reiterate that there are different conceptions of traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge or local ecological knowledge. But one of my favorite definitions is a body of information about the interconnected elements of the natural environment, which traditional Indigenous peoples have been taught from generation to generation to respect and give thanks for. And I think that that really sums it up quite well, because it is a very living conceptualization and a living science. So of course, when we look at the concepts of attributes of traditional ecological knowledge, it is very holistic, it is very intuitive. As I was saying, it has a lot of moral ethics, and is very based and rooted in spiritual context, as we've heard again with a lot of the research that we've been hearing throughout this platform. It very much exhibits, humility and a refined sense of responsibility. And it does not aim to control nature. So it's really quite different, which brings us often to the question of ownership in relation or versus relational engagement, which we also just heard about, which is fantastic. So again, it's very much based on mutual well-being, reciprocity, and cooperation, and often contextualized within the spiritual, which is the form of science that we're talking about here in conservation. So one of the things that we've, even for me, within my own traditional knowledge, which is North African, we have heard as children many stories of a relationship with environment. And so although this presentation is about the role of spirituality, sacredness in conservation, I think that just to bring the point home from our previous presenter, the stories of relationships and the research that I've done globally is to really relate kinship between species and mutual respect. So, which also means not over extraction, right? So there's many stories that share this relationship in bringing balance to the ecosystems that we are part of, or that ecosystem-based peoples rely on, and so do we in a more removed manner, I suppose. But one of the in previously conducted research on different understandings of magic, for example. And as an ethnobotanist, I concentrated a lot on traditional medicine and the conceptualization of diagnostic tools. And although this may seem unrelated, I found the same thread in conservation management. So what one of the examples that is related to me a lot is in many of the Pacific Northwest coast of Canada, amongst others in Eastern Canada as well, actually, and in Japan, and so on and so forth. There is this concept of clan kinship based on animal ancestors. And so what that means is that each family would be from an ancestor that would be either of an animal entity, so a raven or a wolf or so on and so forth. And so what that did is that it created this deep understanding of that species and the relationship, symbiotic relationship with the ecosystems. And those families would carry this knowledge essentially in the role of this species within that environment. And so this was a form of specialization, if we'd like, scientifically speaking. So one of the biggest issues that I think that we keep sort of running into is the concept of reconciling ways of knowing and the different types of sciences. So we have sort of Western academic science, and then there is also indigenous science and local ecological science. And a lot of the work that's been happening here in Canada recently, which has been so important, is the concept of reconciling ways of knowing. And the reason why that's important is because, in a way, scientifically, we've been very lopsided, so very Cartesian in the way that we've been operating, essentially, which is great and fine. But a lot of the work that we do also tries to elucidate that is not the only way of knowing, and that there is a lot of various scientific methods that are in fact based on spirituality, but has been disconnected from Western science. And so a lot of the work that is happening now is trying to find the connections between the two. And a lot of what I've been hearing through this platform is the importance of traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous ecological knowledge to become part of policy as well in conservation. And so there is a transition that is happening, which is very exciting, I think. So, so some of the conceptual frameworks of sacredness and conservation is that, and that is very different from the way that we've been operating in conservation in the world through a dominant lens, is that when we're looking at ecosystems and the different beings that are part of them, they are sentient beings. So, and that has been a really big difference in our extractive economies. But so essentially what that means is that they're able to feel, right? And that relational lens, right, that that spirituality offers is one that is missing from our industrialized framework. So, and unfortunately, the absence of this connection is one of the main causes of the denigration of our ecosystems. And and again, within tech, traditional ecological knowledge, there's big recognition of the sentientness and the relationship that we have with ecosystems, and spirituality and sacredness and conservation. It actually is what spurred conservation through UNESCO World Heritage Sites, for example. So there are many, many case studies, but one of them that I that I like to think about is from the Non-Human Rights Project, which was actually the only civil rights organization in the US working to secure legal rights for non-human animals, right? And there was a ruling, and I believe it was in 2017, that a captive chimpanzee named Cecilia was a non-human legal person with inherent rights. And I mean, what's interesting about that is that once, the idea is that once we recognize the sentientness of one being, then essentially we are able to go farther and realize the sentientness of all beings, right? Which is very much based on the concept of our connection with ecosystems. I know that I've talked about the Wanganui River in New Zealand as well, which was giving legal personhood. Again, very, very much based on the relationship, the sacred and spiritual relationship that Maori peoples have with the river and the ecosystem. And thankfully, there's more and more examples as we go, of course, in 2017, the recognition of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers as legal persons because of their sacred and revered status. One of the other really important aspects that we've seen through the IUCN and Sacred Natural Sites research is there's so many examples. Essentially, there's the customary Maori Fisheries, where, again, within Maori culture, all elements of the natural world originate from the gods and are thus imbued with mana, which is the presence and power of the gods. And fish, like all living beings, are possessed of Maori, so which is the physical life force. So again, there's this relational lens and sacredness to this relationship, and to the beings that are here, which is again very different from our current dominant culture. We have, again, there are thousands of examples. There's the sacred groves in India and Ghana, right? Sacred forests of Enkio, of the Maasai. And one of the quotes from one of the Maasai elders is that the Naimina Enkio Indigenous forest is the center of their lives. It means our survival, our spirit, our past, and our future. As we're part of it, it is part of us. The forest is the holy temple or shrine of our people. And it also is the place of worship and communion. And I mean, again, there's countless and countless examples. And this conceptualization, epistemology of sacred spaces and of the spiritual connection between people and ecosystems is a very important part of natural conservation, if we'd like, because this, I mean, the presentation is about the role of the ethics and sacredness, religion as well, in conservation. It's important to note that that there's no actually agreed upon definition of either religion or spirituality at this point. But, generally, we can say that religion has a set of practical ethics, and spirituality is often part of religion, but not necessarily so. However, both contain aspects of ecological conservation through an ethics lens. Unfortunately, however, we've seen that religions have often destroyed original sacred sites from Indigenous communities. And again, this is not to demonize religion or so on, because there is a state and governance aspect of religion that is very different from the spirituality aspect of religion as well. So religion, spirituality, and sacred teachings are based essentially on ethics. And, of course, as we know, ethics is concerned with what is good for individuals and society, is also described as moral philosophy. The term is derived from the Greek word ethos, which again means that custom, habit, character, and disposition, all of which are to address social cohesion and environmental well-being for survival and the survival of all others, technically. Spirituality can be argued to bring those connections into practical and physical experience, essentially. Relational engagement and connection with environment is a palpable experience, which is felt both physically and mentally, and can be construed as a spiritual experience of sorts. But the relationship between natural sites of Indigenous and traditional peoples with the world's major faiths, as I was saying, has in some cases a complex and troublesome history. Many traditional sacred natural sites have been appropriated or destroyed because they were considered pagan or so on by newly emerging world faiths. This is not to confuse religion with the behavior, state behavior, with the spirituality of religion and ethics. Human behavior in this realm has been very confusing. And what we're trying to see, or what we're seeing now in anthropological research, but also thankfully in the emergence of Indigenous voices in conservation, is the importance of this relational engagement with ecosystems and protecting these areas. So in summary, I think diversifying conservation has been fundamentally lacking traditional ecological knowledge. Again, something that we've heard over and over again, but the importance of encompassing the relational connections between humans and ecosystems, which actually holds a historical connection that we think are very fundamental to conservation and wildlife management practices. And these come again in different forms, whether it is through a relationship, spirituality. We talked about sacred sites, which have been acknowledged by some, but not by many. We have definitely situations around the world, including here in British Columbia, where there is heavy deforestation, for example, of sacred sites, and it has been a very confusing adjustment and reconciling these two ways understanding and of relating to the ecosystem. And yes, I believe that's the rest of my presentation. Wow, I'm early this time instead of late. That's great. Please let me know if anyone has any questions.
Okay, thank you, Nejma. That was wonderful. I like to buy this term called sacredness in conservation. I think, as I understand, it's sacredness in belief, sacredness in terms of perception. I mean, that's how people perceive. That's how people make decisions, and that's how people would like to deal with the environment. And that was quite interesting, and I'd like to specifically. I'm sorry. I have no idea, no knowledge on the traditional ecological knowledge. But I think this sacredness in conservation, I'm going to chant this for 10 times tonight. Thank you, Nejma, for this.